Welcome to the Ascent Series. Have you ever been in a situation where you are told narratives about something and you believe them wholeheartedly? But then, when you witness things with your very open eyes, your own assumptions got thoroughly challenged. There will always be people who agree, and there will also be people who disagree. But you trust your own account nonetheless, and that account of personal anecdotes can be something that might change your life forever for the better. For me, it began with pure curiosity, and I came out of it with my eyes wide open. People with strong opinions would advise against pursuing this very thing, but then I was just too stubborn, and I did it anyway, because I went to North Korea in 2013. Today, I will share with you the stories from that very trip in the perspectives that you might have never ever heard before on the internet. Welcome to the Ascent Series. This is the third episode of the first season, Base Camp. I am Dr. Vasut Pornpacharapong from the International College of Digital Innovation, or ICDI, at Chiang Mai University. As before, and in all the following episodes, I am your Sherpa, guiding your ascent. You climb together with my four selves, the scientist, the traveler, the runner, and the artist, through their authentic intelligence. Because in life, you may have assumed something to be true without questioning it, or without questioning the nuances. That even in a system as close as North Korea, the reality is actually not all black and white. The reality is actually shades of gray, just as with everything else. In this episode, I will start from talking about the journey itself and close with the usual narrative for your ascent. The reality in front of you is actually more complex than you have ever imagined, and sometimes you just have to see things with your open eyes to make the best judgment. Without much further ado, let's pack our bags and join me in a journey to the most secretive country in the world. But before we begin, please refrain from polarizing political comments, because I do not actually intend for this content to be political. Any political comments will be moderated, so please. And then, without much further ado, let's rewind the clock back to 2013. Back then, I was in the middle of my Ph.D. at UC San Diego, studying theoretical chemistry. I was planning a solo month-long adventure in the same fashion as a Trans-Siberian trip I made in 2009, which I covered in the previous episode. I've been to Europe, and a year ago I went on another adventure of similar scale in 2012 through Chile, Bolivia, and Peru, so I explored South America. And then, to maximize the narrative value of this adventure, I shouldn't pick either of these continents, right? So, the remaining choices were Africa, Asia, and Oceania, and then, of course, Antarctica. But Antarctica was just a logistical nightmare and too expensive. And then Africa still felt a little rough. So, Oceania, I don't know. But that only left me with just Asia, right? But wait, aren't you already Asian? Right. But Asia is actually such a diverse continent, and there are lots of off-the-beaten-path destinations. I actually also had some leftover airline miles that I could redeem for the first-class trans-Pacific travel from California to China, but not actually quite further than that. Knowing that geographical constraints of the mileage redemption, to maximize the flying experience while also maximizing the raw experiential factor, the only valid choice would have been a trip spanning multiple countries that include Mongolia and North Korea. That was how the trip was conceived, starting in Mongolia and then through China and ended in North Korea, all through rail. Because North Korea was on the itinerary, and then it's not exactly the place that you can carry your backpack and just enter freely, right? I had to secure the entry in advance. I searched online for a reputable tour company, so I looked at their Liberation Day 5-day tour from mid-August 2013, booked it, and planned the rest of my itinerary accordingly. And then in the spirit of this episode, I will just jump right into North Korea itself. I still remember the date, August 12, 2013. I just finished the Chinese part of the itinerary, from the Mongolian border at Arlian to Datong, Xi'an, Lanzhou, and out to the middle of the Silk Road Desert at Dunhuang. From Dunhuang, I took the slow sleeper train back to Xi'an and then marveled at the Chinese G train from Xi'an to Beijing at 300 kilometers per hour. And then it was at Beijing that my tour company called the whole group to meet at a hostel in central Beijing to brief about what to do and, more importantly, of course, what not to do. Hannah's North Korean visa, which weren't actually pasted into passports because they are just simply pieces of paper. And then they also told us what to buy as souvenirs for our guides and got our cash in euro or Chinese yuan because North Korea does not accept US dollars. And oh, one more thing, in the context of this tour, calling the country North Korea is actually inappropriate. And to show a proper respect as any travelers should do when travel into the foreign lands, what we usually known as North Korea is usually addressed as the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or the DPRK in short. This is important because I needed to remind myself that I have to behave properly. The orientation ended in the afternoon when the Western guide told the group to prepare for the evening departure from Beijing railway station. I spent that afternoon in Beijing getting my euros because I was told that the Chinese yuan has a far worse exchange rate in the DPRK. I also went to a Beijing supermarket to get some packs of cigarettes because I was told that our male tour guides love them. It felt rather weird because I'm not actually a smoker, but then I finally went to the railway station in the evening and met the whole group again in the station lounge. The group's composition contains 2 South Africans, 2 Canadians, 2 Singaporeans, an American, a Russian, an Irish, and of course, a Thai. Some of my group mates were also English teachers from South Korea. Our Western tour guides were an Aussie, so that was a pretty diverse group, isn't it? The American tourist in our group struck me as a very well-mannered guy, since he was a Ph.D. student in history, so he knew and respected proper boundaries. The Western tour guide would stay with us for the entire trip, from Beijing and then back to Beijing again. We took time in the station to bond together before we were called to board the train to Pyongyang that left early in that night. The train ride in China was actually really smooth back in 2013. China was definitely good in infrastructure even back then. Even if the train traveled at 120 kilometers per hour, there were no noticeable shakes and vibrations and I slept rather well until I woke up in the next morning and see the train parked on the platform at the final Chinese station before crossing the border, Dantong Station. The train stopped for quite a long while that I could get off the cabin to stretch my legs, walk a little bit around the station square, and then eventually I was called to board the train. And here was when the real adventure began. Yes, this whole trip began since early July, but it was this very day, August 13, 2013, when I was about to board the train into the unknown. What lay beyond that secretive border? Will I actually come out okay? Is North Korea, the DPRK, anything like I have always been heard from the media? I didn't know at the time, but these questions will finally be answered soon on the other side of the Yalu River. Bye bye, China.
And now we need to.
Bye bye.
This is his, right?
No, it's mine.
Do you got one of
It's
these?
mine. It's mine. That's mine.
You got one of those?
Oh, I have mine too. It's
Those are
fine.
good for shooting video. 'Cause then you can put like the ISO like on your picture.
Oh, it's not mine.
It's mine.
I was so upset.
What? You thought he stole your noodle?
It's actually broken phone. I can't buy one as well.
You should have said, yeah, that's yours. It's funny, I was on this bridge over here. At the end, it's
Uh-oh.
broken. And then I had like my zoom lens, and you can shoot, and they take you on a boat all along North Korea, right there. And then there's like kids that are waving at them and talking to them, and then you got army soldiers like on the side, fishermen. It's kind of cool. Yeah, you took the boat and you stopped, and there's kids sitting at the side playing, and they're just like yelling at us.
Back to the month.
I think it's impossible.
Oh.
Yeah.
안녕하세요, Shoson.
I guess we have to. Oh, there you go.
Yeah, but we still have no charge for mine.
You go ahead first. I'll just.
Okay, I can wait, no problem. It's okay, no problem. Just I think it's just half an hour. It's half an hour for me.
I know one word.
Which?
Привет.
Привет.
Alright.
Пока.
What's that?
Привет is hello.
Hello.
I thought you said fuck off.
Пока it's bye bye.
Пока, it's bye-bye, yeah.
And I know Alexander Ovechkin.
Alexander Ovechkin, yeah. Hockey player.
And I know all the hockey players. I'm Canadian. Sergei Fedorov.
There are a lot of Russians in the Canadian team.
Yeah. A lot of Russians play hockey.
Здрасте.
It's North Korea.
Мы к вам приехали.
Now that I have officially crossed into the DPRK, the train stopped at the first DPRK station right after the bridge, Sinuiju Station. There, the DPRK officials boarded our cabin to check our documents, especially the piece of visa paper we got the day before. The crucial thing here is they also checked all your electronic devices, like all of them. They inspected my tablet, curious about a Thai movie on it, wondering if it were a pornography or religious contents, which were strictly prohibited and punishable by DPRK law. I politely explained to them that it was simply a Thai movie and they let it pass without any issues. I was also allowed to keep my phone, Samsung Galaxy S4 at the time. What an irony, right? So, that was unlike any previous account I read that phones were supposed to be wrapped and prohibited from use until the final departure. Actually, by that, I was quite surprised that I was allowed to keep my phone. And then, after an hour, the train rolled again, but then I noticed something. The tracks weren't actually in a very good condition, and I could see broken concrete ties all over, which meant the train couldn't travel quickly like it was in China. The speed would be around 40 kilometers per hour at best, which was a stark contrast to the experience on the Chinese side, even when I was on the exact same Chinese sleeper cabin. Then, as my curiosity dictated me, I also looked around, and the difference from the Chinese side was just so stark. Apartments were so old and dilapidated, and then the common living room was equipped with an old-fashioned incandescent bulb. Yes, just one of that, when the rest of the world at least used fluorescent bulbs, or transitioning into the LEDs. Streets were also devoid of cars, and most people actually walked, and even bicycle felt like a luxury. And as the train rolled out of Sinuiju, the rolling fields of the DPRK countryside appeared, and they still mostly relied on animal labors. It just definitely felt like I was traveling back in time into 1980s or something similar. I even actually wonder for people who live right on the shores of Yalu River in Sinuiju, seeing Tantong city light every day. Because I kind of wonder how would they actually feel in contrast to the dilapidated buildings on their own side. The train kept chugging despite the slow anemic speed through the DPRK countryside, passing so many propaganda posters and obelisks, passing so many stations adorned with portraits of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, and then finally, In the afternoon of August 13, 2013, the train arrived in Pyongyang Station, and the Korean tour guides welcomed us from there. Our group had two guides, one woman and one man, where the woman did all the talking and explanations, while a man who was very quiet and he spoke very little. The female guide told the group that the man was an apprentice guide. We were told that we weren't whisked to the hall right away, but the first place that we went after we got off the train was the giant statues of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il in central Pyongyang, where we would pay our respects to the great leaders with the flower bouquets for sale on the spot for €5. We went, we behaved, and didn't cause any stirs, as it seemed that all of us in the group knew beforehand what to be expected in this kind of trip. We were taken, then, to the Yanggakdo Hotel on the island in the middle of the Tadong River, which is the hotel usually designated for foreign tourists who come to the DPRK, and then we had a dinner at the hotel and got to sleep for the night. The entire trip was like a journey into a highly specialized theme park. On the second day, we went right to the tension point between the two Koreas, the demilitarized zone, colloquially known in English as the DMZ. We visited the Korean War Museum, were told the history of the Korean War from their side, and then went to the famous spot that Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un actually met on the border. We spent afternoon in nearby Kaesong, an ancient Korean capital, and it was also my first time tasting a dog meat soup, which I specifically requested for the experience, but I actually regretted that later. And then on the next day, which was the climax day of the trip, we went to the Kumsusan Memorial, which was where the embalmed bodies of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il were laid. It felt like the place where the members of their military came and take photos, and then we were told to dress properly at this place, and photography was strictly prohibited inside. Let me actually recall the experience from that time. As we entered the building, there were a series of moving walkways along the corridor, and at the end of each walkway, there were rotating brushes to clean your shoes from dirt, and then as we entered the main hall, the giant blowers were installed at the door frame to blow away dust from your clothes, so that we entered the hall spanking clean. And inside the hall, the building was actually really dark, until we were in the room where the embalmed bodies of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il were placed in their own brightly lit glass coffins, resting over the red velvets, and we were told to be completely silent and circle around their coffins 3 times. Once the respects were paid, we were shown historical artifacts from the early era of the DPRK, and then the train cabins that the previous leaders used in their diplomatic trips to Russia. But then it wasn't the only thing we did on the third day, for we also went to Kim Il-sung's birthplace, experienced the Pyongyang subway rides where stations were decorated in revolutionary art motifs, and then exited at the central hill where locals danced around in festive mood. For it was August 15, the Liberation Day from the Japanese aggression in their calendar. The third night was also the highlight of the entire trip, because I also elected to watch the Arirang Mass Games in Rungrado Mayday Stadium, where students perform perfectly choreographed movements, and oh my, it just felt like opening ceremonies of Olympic Games, really. The show tells the story of Korea from the ancient era to the modern era, the Korean War, and the separation of two Koreas, and then the leadership of the Korean Worker Party that brings DPRK into the modern era, and the eventual unification of the two Koreas. And then the show ended with march music and explosive fireworks. It felt like if we cut the political bias from this show, this was actually such a great show that aroused emotion and secreted my adrenaline to a very high level. Too bad they no longer do this nowadays. And then came the last day in the DPRK for this program, where we went to the film studio and then the central library, walked along the streets of Pyongyang and witnessed the famous traffic ladies at the intersections who directed traffic with precisions, like robots, really. And then the Tower of Juche idea, symbolizing the ideology of self-reliance. And then the final destination of the trip was the Hall of the Children, which actually I forgot the name. It was a long time ago, but then it was a place where they showcased the children's excellence in embroidery, calligraphy, and dancing. The place actually seemed normal, but then as I exited the place to board my tour bus, this became the most memorable moment of the entire journey in the DPRK because I saw a truck carrying high school students parked nearby with some students on it. I looked out of my bus window, smiled, and waved back at the truck. And then to my surprise, one of the students on that truck actually smiled and waved back at me too. And then the last night in the DPRK was actually wild because the entire tour threw a farewell party, which also ended revealing yet another secret in the DPRK because two of our group members needed the flight information from Beijing and they just couldn't access the internet from their phone, right? The Western and the Korean guys in our group seemed to negotiate a lot, and in the end, they could actually access the internet, which actually I didn't know how, and they didn't actually tell me either, but it wasn't that restrictive as I thought. And then, it was the time to bid the final farewell to this strange yet surreal country. I came in by train, and then I leave by plane, because something in me wanted to experience the only Skytrack one-star airline on Earth, Air Korea, with its old Tupolev 147 plane from Pyongyang to Beijing. Since I'm talking on this podcast, so nothing really happened, but actually the food was so atrocious. I spent another night in Beijing before flying back to California to resume my Ph.D. journey. Yep, that was it. While I actually rambled for quite a long time, you may wonder what exactly do I want to tell you for this episode. When talking about North Korea, the first thing that came to your mind would be the preconceived ideas of how the country is like, because the country acts like a thermodynamically closed system where matters cannot transfer between the system and the surroundings. But as tourists, however small numbers, become just like the energy that can transfer between the system and the surrounding for closed systems. Because the matters cannot be transferred out, we, as the outsiders, do not exactly know what's going on inside the system, so we try to extrapolate from whatever limited data we may have to build a model of their society. And as with any AI or machine learning models, they are prone to bias because they are trying to predict data with the basic knowledge of what we are used to. And we can easily conflate our life, our moral, and political stances on them unknowingly. But if we actually zoom in closer to the specific experience from my own journey, the last day that I saw the smile of the North Korean student who waved back at me, and then the wild party afterwards, this fact crashed my preconceived model of North Korea profoundly. I am aware that they are not the most morally upright nation on earth, but they are not all that evil either. We felt the urge to view the world in blacks and whites, while in fact, the world is simply shades of gray where nothing is all good and nothing is all bad either. And then the final physics lesson for this episode. In any thermodynamic closed system, the system won't change anything if there are no energy transfer. To change or influence the system, the flow of the energy must happen, and only then equilibrium between the system and the surroundings can eventually be established. And here comes the homework for this episode, which brings us to your homework right now, because I want you to identify the closed system in your own life. It could be a person you have avoided, or a department at your workplace you don't understand, or a political or social idea you have completely written off based on what others have told you. You have built a predictive model about them without actually testing it. Your task this week is to be the energy transfer, step across the boundary, have one direct conversation, read one primary source, or make one first-hand observation, inject your energy into that closed system, and see how quickly your preconceived model collapses. And then the next episode, as I promised from the second episode that I will take you to the Kilimanjaro, so I will do just that. I will take you through the first primordial ascent, the first time that the concept of this very channel, the Ascent series, came about, and why actually I chose the name Ascent I will guide you through the ascent of Mount Kilimanjaro and then mix it with the undeniable universal truth of physics and how the ascent and the physics of climbing Kilimanjaro go together in one of these episodes of the Base Camp season for the Ascent series. And here's the end of this episode. So I will see you in the next episode on May 17, 2026. This is the Ascent series, and I am Dr. Wasut Pornpachorapong from ICDI, Chiang Mai University. Thank you for watching, and goodbye. See you guys again next month. สวัสดีครับ